All right, so chapter 17 is called The Pastor and His Parishioner. And basically, at the end of chapter 16, Hester sees Dimmesdale coming. And at the start, so in section 1 of chapter 17, Hester and Dimmesdale see each other. So Dimmesdale also sees her. And they like question, like, is this real? Are you real? Like, is this really happening? It was like almost like they felt like the other was, and even themselves, they felt like they were ghosts and like spirits, and like they were meeting in an afterlife. I mean, it's been 7 years since they've probably, I assume, have had a conversation alone. Um, and so it just doesn't even feel real. Um, okay, so in section 2, looking at how the townspeople view Dimmesdale, I mean, we already know this, but um, things like the people reverence thee, like he's very highly respected, and he says about how many eyes turned upward to my face as if the light of heaven were beaming from it. So just further evidence of how much they adore him, they idolize him, they think he's amazing, very highly respected. Okay, so now let's look at his struggles. So one of them, he asks, what can a ruined soul like mine affect towards the redemption of other souls, or a polluted soul towards their purification? This isn't working very well. And so basically this idea that he doubts himself, okay, and the effect that he can have on his congregation. Basically, like, how can, like, my polluted soul purify theirs, right? And this is a real struggle that he faces. And then also coming back to this idea of hypocrisy. So he struggles with being a hypocrite. He talks about the contrast between what I seem and what I am, and the black reality of what they idolize. So another struggle is that he struggles with himself being a hypocrite. Um, okay, and then down here, he says, of penance I have had enough, of penitence there has been none. Okay, and so if you look at the word penance, so this is like the self-punishment that he has been, inflicting on himself. So he's saying, I've had enough whipping, I've had enough, fasting, I've had enough keeping myself awake, I've had enough cutting or whatever he's doing to his chest to make that A, right? So he's saying, of penance, I've had enough. But he says, of penitence, there has been none. Okay, and so what that basically means is that he doesn't feel bad for his relationship with Hester. He doesn't feel guilty, he doesn't regret it. And this is something that I think he genuinely struggles with, because biblically, he knows what he did is wrong or was wrong. He knows he should be punished, and so therefore he's punishing himself. But he doesn't feel bad about it, like in his heart. And I think this is a massive struggle for Dimmesdale, and also kind of makes us like him a little bit more, right? Because he can't bring himself to regret it. Like, he's happy it happened, and so definitely, I mean, probably it makes him punish himself longer and more because he doesn't feel the guilt for it, or doesn't feel the regret. Like, okay, and so down here, this idea of how it's like a relief to be with each other, and for Dimmesdale to have someone who like sees him for who he really is, that's a relief. And he opens up the door by mentioning his worst enemy. Okay, and so this is gonna, give Hester a chance to be like, so you know that enemy you're talking about, and bring up Chillingworth. So in section 3, what we're looking at is, how does Hester prove to be a strong character, and how does Dimmesdale prove to be a weak character? And so she is, brings up the fact that, you do have an enemy and you live with him, right? And so just reminding you that Dimmesdale and Chillingworth do both rent rooms from the same woman, so they do live under the same roof. And so he's completely shocked. He jumps to his feet. He gasps for breath. He clutches his heart, and he questions what she's talking about. So she she understands the harm she's done to him. And this part is just really cute, so I'm going to read it to you. It says, such was the ruin to which she had brought the man once. Nay, why should we not speak it? Still so passionately loved. I just think it's cute. Right down here, there's this idea that, well, this is really hard for her to do, right? It says that she'd rather have laid down and died than to confess this, but she does it anyways. So just this idea of like confessing when something's really hard to confess, like that takes strength, right? And she's strong for doing that. And then here, Dimmesdale's weakness, it says that his character had been so enfeebled by suffering, and it says that he is incapable of more than a temporary struggle. So those are a couple of things that help show that he's weak. And then at the top of page 4, we've got Dimmesdale saying, I cannot forgive thee. Okay. And then right down here, I do forgive you, Hester. And so look how quick that happens, right? And so this just brings us back to this idea that he's incapable of more than a temporary struggle. He forgives her very, very quickly. He actually doesn't fight that much about it. And here, too, it says he would have released himself, but strove in vain to do so. Hester would not set him free. And so just this idea of, like, her being stronger than he is, and, like, he can't even get away from her. Like, she's totally the one in control. I mean, even here, she tells him, thou shalt forgive me. Thou shalt forgive me, right? And then she clutches him to her chest, and she won't let go. Definitely showing her strength. But this is the absolute best part, okay? So it says, all the world had frowned on her. For 7 long years had it frowned upon this lonely woman, and still she bore it all, nor ever once turned away her firm, sad eyes. Heaven likewise had frowned upon her, and she had not died. Okay, so this woman, she bore it all. Okay, and she never even looked down. Right, she kept her head up. An amazing quote to show Hester's strength. And then this right here just does help us to see her weakness. It says, but the frown of this pale, weak, sinful, and sorrow-stricken man was what Hester could not bear and live. Okay, so her weakness, like she can't bear to see him like this, and struggling, and because she loves him so much. Okay, so this part I think is cute too. She says, what we did had a consecration of its own, a sacredness of its own. We felt it. We said so to each other. Have you forgotten? And he's like, hush, Hester, hush. And then he's like, no, I haven't forgotten. I think that's cute too. Okay, so in section 4, they stay and they let another and another, and after all, another moment. And it talks about how they lingered. So they lingered an instant longer. They don't want to go back, okay? And this line I really like. No golden light had ever been so precious as the gloom of this dark forest. I mean, it's ironic because you wouldn't expect that the gloom of a dark forest is better than golden light, but in the case, like for Hester and Dimmesdale, it is. Like being in the dark forest together is better than, going back to society, or being, well, I guess their hidden relationship, right? It talks about how they, sorry, it's not working. Okay, here seen only by his eyes, the scarlet letter need not burn into the bosom of the fallen woman, and here seen only by her eyes, Arthur Dimmesdale, false to God and man, might be, for one moment, true. Just this idea that they find freedom in each other. All right, the top of page 5. So we're looking at Hester's strength. And so Dimsdale says, "Think for me, Hester, thou art strong, resolve for me." And so her first piece of advice is you can't go back to living with Chillingworth, right? And then his weakness. "Shall I lie down again on these withered leaves where I cast myself when thou didst tell me what he was? Must I sink down there and die at once?" And so there's this reoccurring idea that, like, as she's trying to help, he just keeps, being like, "I'm just gonna lay here and die. I'm just gonna lay here and die. It's just too much. I'm just gonna lay here and die," right? Over and over again. You're gonna see that. She asks, "Will thou die for very weakness?" Right? And he says, "It's too much for me to struggle with." So all these are great examples showing his weakness. This doesn't work very well. All right. He says, "Be thou strong for me, advise me what to do," right? And so again, more evidence of her strength. And so then she gives him more advice. She's like, "Don't go back to town," right? Like, go out into the forest, go deeper into the forest. And we have an example again of his weakness. It describes him as having a spirit so shattered and subdued that it could hardly hold itself erect. And he says here, like, "Yes, but I'll only stay out in the forest under the fallen leaves," right? Like, I'm just going to lay here. And that reminds us of the end of the last chapter where it talks about how it's like he just was going to lie down, and whether he was dead or not, the earth was going to cover him. Okay, so then she's like, "Fine, like, go back to England, right? Or go to Germany or France or go to Italy, like, get out of here," right? And this quote is excellent as far as transcendentalist ideas in the text, because she says, "And what hast thou to do with all these iron men and their opinions? They have kept thy better part in bondage too long already." So, like, I don't know if you remember, but there's a video at the start of the try, intro to transcendentalism, and in the video there's a picture of a person inside a cage, and this really makes me think of that, right? Like, people are trapped by society and by society's opinions and society's expectations. Like, people are in bondage. And so this is just a really great example of a transcendentalist idea in this text. But he says, "I'm powerless to go," right here, and he needs to remain in the sphere where Providence hath placed me. And so Puritans, they believed in predestination, right? So they believed that, like, your whole life had already been determined. God already had everything set up. He already knew what was going to happen, all the choices you were going to make, if you were going to go to heaven or hell. And so it helps us to, in a way, to better understand Dimsdale and his passiveness and his inaction, because he actually doesn't think he has any control, right? He thinks this has already all been set out, and he's just a victim of fate. Lastly, we've got "Thou art crushed under his 7 years' weight of misery," again emphasizing Dimsdale's weakness. And then what we have is an amazing, basically motivational, persuasive speech that Hester gives. And actually, this is so beautifully written, and it's one of my favorite parts of this entire book. And so Hester says to him, I'll read you my favorite parts. She says, "Leave this wreck and ruin here where it hath happened." She says, "There is happiness to be enjoyed. There is good to be done. Exchange this false life of thine for a true one." She says, "Preach, write, act, do anything save to lie down and die. Give up this name of Arthur Dimsdale, and make thyself another, and a high one, such as thou canst wear without fear or shame." Right? It's beautifully written. And in fact, as we move in, and like persuasive writing and argumentative writing, I mean, we can learn from this, right? And so using commands, "Leave this wreck and ruin, exchange this false life, preach, write, act, do anything save to lie down and die," right? "Give up this name, like, make thyself another," right? So this idea of having a commanding tone to your writing is persuasive, right? And something that I'd like you to practice doing when you're writing, argumentative, persuasive pieces like you do for the ACT writing test. Another thing is using rhetorical questions. Hast thou exhausted possibility in the failure of this one trial? And down here, why shouldst thou tarry so much as one other day in the torments that have not into thy life, right? Using those rhetorical questions, using short sentences, not so, preach, write, act. Those are all short sentences and they're powerful. Begin all anew, that's a short sentence. Repetition, where he starts off two sentences exactly the same, that is really powerful when you're reading it. There's happiness to be enjoyed. There's good to be done, right? The repetition, it sounds good, and it is persuasive, or it can be used to be persuasive. And here, preach, write, act. It's called the rule of three. And like when you're writing or when you're speaking, like the rule of three sounds good to the ear. It kind of like sounds complete. And so using that can also make your writing really persuasive. So I also want to talk about, besides that, it's just amazing, okay, what she says and the writing, is that how we can see some transcendentalism ideas in this motivational speech she gives. So this idea that there's happiness out there, right? And to exchange a false life for a true one, and just how transcendentalists believe that you need to go out and you need to follow your own intuition, and you can't just be bound by society because you're going to be miserable, right? You need to get out, break away, and be true, right? Like be yourself, and whoever that is, right? And finally, just one more time coming back to Dimsdale's weakness. So it's like he like kind of lights up. He's kindled by her enthusiasm, but then it dies away, right? And he says, you're talking about running a race to a man whose knees are tottering beneath him. Like, I'm too weak. And he says, I must die here, right? There's not the strength or courage left me to venture into the wide, strange, difficult world alone. It talks about the despondency of a broken spirit. Like, he's hopeless, right? He lacks energy to grasp the better fortune that seemed within his reach. So just a contrast in how weak he is and how strong she is and how she tries to use her strength. In fact, it says it right here. She was fervently resolved to buoy him up with her own energy. Like, she is trying, right? And the end is so sweet. I think it's so sweet because he's like, I mean, I feel like he's kind of hinting, like, I can't go alone. And then he's like, alone, Hester, right? And then she says, thou shalt not go alone, in a deep whisper. And it says, then all was spoken, which obviously you have to infer that she's going to go with them, right? Which I love. So make sure you finish it off, okay? I don't mind if you bullet point it, but it's good to come back and be like, okay, in that section I just read, what did Hester do or say or whatever to prove that she's strong? And in that section, what did Dimsdale say or do, or how is he described, that prove that he's weak, okay? And then make sure that you highlight the essential questions. So now that we've done it, do you feel like if you had to do it again, you would need support? Do you feel like you'd be able to do it by yourself? Or do you feel like you would be able to teach it to other people? And then the learning targets and skills. How well do you feel like you can read for what is directly said and what is implied? Okay, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, I hope you love it. And I hope you love chapter 18 too.